This podcast was recorded in the summer of 2023.
As soon as I hear anywhere somebody speaking Arabic, I prick up my ears. And I say to myself, I wonder. Because one of the things is, I feel I have more in common with an Egyptian when I go back to Alexandria or Cairo than with a Hasidic Jew from Stanford.
Definitely.
And that shocks a lot on my Jewish friends.
Hello, my name's Nick.
Hi, my name's Tash.
And welcome to episode 2 of Machloket, a disagreement for a greater good.
Or Machloket.
So this podcast is one element of a community arts project,
where we explore, share and celebrate what life is like for all kinds of Jewish people in the UK.
And to do this, we visited 30 different community groups around the country.
In this episode, you are going to hear a group of Egyptian Jewish refugees and a group of people who think they are not Jewish enough.
And first, some Year 10 students from a Jewish secondary school. Now, neither Tash or I went to Jewish schools, but we both knew a lot of people who did. There's quite a few Jewish schools in the UK.
According to the Institute of Jewish Policy Research, there are 133 Jewish schools in the UK.
They're generally divided along observance lines, so ultra-Orthodox schools, and Reform schools.
This school we visited is a secondary state school in a leafy suburb of North London, and it's pluralist in its religious outlook.
Going to a Jewish secondary school, I also went to a Jewish primary school. So I guess just how I was raised, and also just, I love the history, Jewish history, and, you know, if you listen to Yiddish songs, and there's Yiddish theatre. So it's something that I connect with.
The school was founded in 2010. It's surrounded by greenery, big fields behind high fences.
The school atrium is airy and bright and open. Exam season is upon us and Be a Mensch is written above the door to the exam hall.
Now in kind of 2000, I think that we're quite privileged to be able to kind of express our religion, and also in the past, obviously the Jewish history, I think that the year that we live in, kind of in our society, we're quite, we're lucky to be able to celebrate quite freely. For example, Purim, we get to go out, dress up. Yeah, especially the area I live in as well. I live in Golders Green.
Yeah.
So it's I'm quite surrounded by it as well, which is nice.
About 15 students sit around a table, with teachers hovering at the edge of each room, coming and going. There's a giggly kind of atmosphere, and birds are chirping in the trees beyond the windows.
If I was on the podcast,
Yeah.
could you make me sound like a chipmunk?
I could.
Although, as we mentioned, there are many different types of Jewish schools, one thing that often unites them is Zionism. The day this conversation is taking place is Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel's Independence Day, and yesterday was Yom HaZikaron, which memorialises those who gave their lives in defence of the State of Israel, as well as civilian victims.
We took this definition from Reform Judaism's website.
Usually, every year we would have an assembly to, remember all the people, that have died in Israel and that, and then, it was, it's emotional and that, but then the day after that we would have a day of happiness and thing, and just the contrast between those 2 days is connecting.
Now there's a state for Jews and it just feels a lot better. I've thought of, so it's a bit dark, but when I first learned about the Holocaust, obviously it's quite a very touchy subject, but it did make me feel a lot closer to my religion, and to know what happened, but what's happened since then is been a really big improvement. It's felt as a Jew, I felt a lot more comfortable knowing that even though this happened, the outcome and everything ended up being okay after a lot, and I think learning about that made me feel in a way more safe. Knowing that there were people who understood and cared.
Mine was going to be focused on the assemblies, because they're a moment when everybody's completely together and mostly feeling the same emotions and things like that. And it can be a good thing, like, it can be a moment to connect with, like, the whole school, so you feel like you're connected with the whole community. But that could also be, like, turned on itself and be negative, because it can be, like, it can get too, like, it's, like, the closeness can be, like, too much. If you're too near people and there's, like, this, like, it can be a lot of sadness. Like, I find that when everybody's feeling that sadness, it can just get, like, stifling, as I said, and there's nowhere to, like, know where that emotion isn't being felt.
What's the end point of those assemblies usually? Is there like, what happens to those emotions, I guess, is my question.
I feel like they kind of go, like, somebody might make a joke about it and then you kind of, like, take a breath and, like, let it all out. Or you're just, like, you're just keeping those emotions within you and, like, just feeling sad for the rest of the day.
Last week I was walking around Trafalgar Square and there was a massive protest of people protesting against Israel, and I stood there next to the big lions and I still had my Magen David necklace on, and I did not feel completely safe because I just felt someone might think that just because I'm Jewish and they can see that, visibly, that I must stand for all that the Israeli government does, and they might come and attack me, just because I'm standing there as a Jew in public.
So security becomes the topic of conversation, and somehow the students end up talking about a hypothetical terror incident.
You said, I'm at a Jewish school and there's nothing anyone can do about it.
This is Olly you're hearing now. He's dramaturg on the project.
Can you say a little bit more about, was that just an off-the-cuff, like, funny comment, or is there something more to it?
Security guards outside, no one's going to burst in and try and shoot you because I'm Jewish.
Right. So you've had quite a strong reaction to that. Can you tell us more about that reaction?
Well, I wasn't expecting him to say that. I wasn't expecting him to say someone's going to come into school and shoot him. It was just a bit of a...
No, he said someone's not going to come in.
Yeah, but no one's going to attempt to shoot him, though. Is what I'm thinking. Why would they come after him, though?
Why would they come after?
Hopefully not him. Hopefully someone else, but not him.
Hopefully someone else.
Hopefully someone else.
He doesn't deserve to die. Like, someone else.
And someone else does.
What about you?
No one deserves to
What,
die.
me?
Yeah.
What?
Would you sacrifice yourself?
I would sacrifice myself. 100%.
We could fit like 12.
Here's Olly and me talking in the car after the workshop. That was... Yeah, and I felt... It did feel double-edged for me because I felt like, oh gosh. On the one hand, feeling Jewish feels accessible to these young people. But on the other hand, there's this real us and them thing which happens around, like... Because, yes, there is a sense of like being a target as a Jewish school, but also it's like it's perpetuated by being in a Jewish environment. But it's also great that he feels able to voice that.
Yes, and they spoke a lot about this is a school where you can express and have a diversity of opinions, and you're going to be supported.
Yeah.
In that debate.
Must be nice, right? To go to Jewish school that celebrates your identity. I remember at my school being made to sing hymns and sit in a chapel, but to go to a school which is your school, where you're in the majority, I wonder what that would have been like. I was always a little jealous of my friends that went to Jewish schools.
Yeah, I did not want to go to a Jewish school. That wasn't for me.
Really? But you got to go home early on a Friday, all the Jewish holidays off?
Yeah, that's true, I can see that. And I do remember when my brother visited an open day for a Jewish secondary school, and he came back and he would not shut up about the food, particularly the smoked salmon bagels.
He's right. Bagels are important. And in this school, you walk in and the words "be a mensch" written in big letters. Mensch, of course, is Yiddish colloquially for a good person. So maybe this school is trying to provide the space for them to embrace their Jewishness and make a positive impact on the world.
And we did get the sense of the empowerment and joy that these children got from going to a Jewish school, of being able to explore their Jewishness in a comfortable place.
But the flip side to this the presence of fear of hate crimes.
So the security makes them constantly aware of a potential threat.
Their dark humour about a school shooting. Is this a sign of their ability to engage with the possibility of violence? Or are they picking up on a paranoia?
Is there a risk that a fear of anti-Semitism, along with centuries of oppression, might end up reinforcing or even defining Jewish identity?
What we witnessed shows just what young Jewish people are grappling with right now when trying to understand and express their identity.
And more broadly, given the complexity, how can Jewish institutions delivering a Jewish education provide a nuanced, secure and celebratory experience of Jewishness in the UK? It's a big task.
One thing that most Jewish people have in common, or everyone I've spoken to anyway, is that we feel we're not Jewish enough, or we've been told so. Have you, Tash? I certainly have.
Yeah, I've been told so, and I've also felt that. And I think that there are so many different elements to this.
Yeah, whether it's about observance and religiosity,
or about culture.
It's about where you grew up.
It's about whether it's one or both of your parents who are Jewish.
It's about your surname.
Knowledge, connections.
You know, I wasn't allowed to go to my local Jewish school, as my great-grandmother converted. Apparently, I wasn't Jewish enough.
I remember going to bar mitzvahs and not being able to understand all the little in-jokes around the benching.
And here are three people who were brought together because they have also experienced this feeling.
I think I've historically never spoken about it. So, and I almost mean never, like people very, very, very close to me wouldn't know. Nicknames at school, but still nobody would know.
We're on Zoom. These participants are here because they have all responded to a tweet we put out asking for people to talk to us who've been told or feel like they're not Jewish enough.
The atmosphere of this one is quiet, reserved. The three people have never met each other before. Everyone is in their 20s or 30s and speaks to us from their homes. Bedroom, kitchen, living room.
As you'll hear, they all come from very different places and backgrounds and cultural contexts.
We're secular Jews because we're from the Soviet Union, where practicing was impossible. Like impossible while having a normal kind of life and a job and security for your family.
I kind of grew up so remotely. What I've kind of realised at the time, what's really, really sad is the times when my only kind of, my primary kind of connection to being Jewish was being on the receiving end of anti-Semitism. And I kind of thought that was kind of all I had. And it's just so sad that like the times when I felt the most Jewish were in those moments, if that makes sense. Just these tiny things from my childhood that I didn't even necessarily realise were, it's really embarrassing, but I didn't even necessarily realise were Jewish things, and then being like, oh, that's not, most people don't do this. And it's just this really lovely sense of like coming back to something that you didn't even realise sort of was different to other people's experiences or whatever. But yeah, I think just about belonging and joy.
I carry around the sense that it's in my body, it's in my skin. I come from a place that like people meet me and read my face as Jewish.
So you've heard from someone who grew up in the Soviet Union. There's a long and complicated Soviet Jewish history, which we won't get into now. But here's one fact for you.
A century ago, the Russian Empire contained the largest Jewish community in the world, numbering about 5 million. Today, the Jewish population of the former Soviet Union is around 500,000.
You've also heard from someone who grew up in rural Wales. In 2011, the census recorded around 2,000 Jewish people in Wales, mainly in the major cities of Cardiff and Swansea.
And the person you're about to hear from grew up in a small town somewhere in the north of England. He didn't tell us where.
For me, about being silent and not opening up about it. I come from a town that had like huge racial problems, not to do with Jewish people, back when I was growing up. So my like formative years, 13, 14, 15, there were like racial tensions specifically in my town. And it just, I don't know, something, when I think back now, I think about those times and why I chose never to say anything to anyone. And I wonder whether it was a fear of being othered, it was a fear of being outcast, a fear of receiving hate from certain like far right groups. And I think I just carried it and then never really addressed it to let it go. So I just stayed silent. So for me, it's about secrets in a way, which sounds shit as a 30, I don't even know how old I am, 35-year-old man. But yeah, it's about secrets. But then also, there's huge parts of the world where those Jewish people haven't had roots and have moved from pillar to post and don't really know their history, don't know which town they're from, don't know where their ancestors are buried or burnt. Like it's so, I think we get lost. It's almost like this, you're chasing dust in a way, trying to like find your history. I didn't even know my surname wasn't my family's name. I didn't know my surname got changed after the war. Excuse me. After the war. I was like, oh, that must be a Jewish surname. And it's not. My granddad just made it up to get work.
Many Ashkenazi Jewish surnames became anglicised through translation, through assimilation, or in the face of anti-Semitism when our ancestors came to the UK. My surname is Hyman, which was anglicised from Chaim, meaning life in Yiddish and Hebrew. And my mum's surname is Kraft, anglicised from Kraftovitz. They were from Moscow.
And my surname, Cassenbaum, well, it was originally Kirschenbaum, which means cherry tree in German. When my family got here, the British immigration officers changed it to Cassenbaum. And then later, around World War II, my family changed it to Cassen to try and sound less German. When I was 24, I changed it back to Cassenbaum, acknowledging some of the change, but bringing back some of the original. Other names in my family, Dobroszycki, that was Polish, that went to Dobros, and that was still too Jewish, so they landed on Delroy. Sheminsky went to Shamitz, Sabursky went to Sober, Greenberg to Green.
This is a very familiar experience of Ashkenazi Jewish people, particularly in the UK. Many or most of us had a name change to sound less Jewish.
Yeah, and to me it feels like an attack on our past.
But saying that, Jewish people were some of the last in Europe assimilated into having to take family names.
And I think I only found out maybe 3-4 years ago. And I'm like, but why? I don't know, I just feel like I'm constantly grasping at stuff that doesn't exist. And the travelling is part of that. Where are our roots? Where do we live? Where do we belong? I suppose coming back to that belonging thing as well. Thanks.
Okay, I'm going to move on. So this question I'm just going to put out there. What would need to change for you to feel Jewish enough?
I think I'd have to have some self-confidence. I think that would have to change. I'd have to have confidence in myself and the fact that I am what I am. And confidence in Britain specifically, because it's where I live, but society to not behave how I think they're going to behave.
We're reflecting now on the conversation and how we're feeling.
I said about silence. I've found myself like my words catching in my chest as I'm saying things. I don't think it's nervousness. I've been on a Zoom before. I sort of get what we're doing here. It's not the situation. You're all super friendly. And so I'm like, well, what is it? What is that thing that's just catching in your diaphragm? And I think it's saying the quiet thing out loud that I never get a chance to do because I'm not really part of a community. And yeah, I have closeted this little thing away for a ton of reasons. But for me, it's that feeling of sharing for one of the first times, which I think was what interested me when you put out the call. because I sort of felt like, kind of feel seen with those few words. But yeah.
After the participants had left the call, Nick and I stayed on it, talking to each other about what we just heard.
And the stuff about silence. What does Jewishness mean for you? Silence. I didn't speak to anyone about it. Anti-Semitism, it feels like that is one of their barriers. Like they're blaming that, maybe rightly in some cases, blaming that for the reason why they haven't accessed that part of themselves so much.
It's like, do you have what's your context? If you're from a small town in the Midlands, then you don't necessarily have like the privilege of being able to be out.
The way you reflected on the grabbing and the dust, the not knowing the changing name, it's quite a universal Jewish experience. But it feels so live to him.
This group was different to any other group we've met because they were not a pre-existing community. They'd never met before. But we felt it was really important to hear from people who identified with the feeling of not feeling Jewish enough.
The image we get of chasing dust, trying to unearth a heritage or legacy in order to better understand yourself. Older generations possibly not sharing their own experiences out of fear or not wanting to go there and not passing it on, which feels so familiar. The older generations avoiding talking about their trauma.
We're also hearing stories of being defined by otherness because of anti-Semitism. Whether that's the experience of growing up in the Soviet Union and not being able to practice Jewishness, or the presence of the far right in a northern town, or being isolated in a rural part of the UK.
I think what characterises this group is a sense of lacking a communal experience of Jewishness. If we reflect back on the other groups we've met, like the LGBTQ+ group, the Cornish group, even the school, they're celebrating and unpicking their Jewishness together. Whereas here, we see individuals without the space or support to do the same.
Moving on to our final group in this episode, these participants all share a similar history of recent expulsion. But just like the experiences of this last group, this is not a straightforward story about lacking safety in foreign lands and plain sailing here in the UK.
Round up the usual suspects.
I think the last time we met must be at least 30 years ago.
Yes, of course.
We are now with a group of 4 people in their 60s and 70s. They came to us via an organisation that specialises in recording the experiences of Jewish people from the Middle East, North Africa, Iran, who settled in the UK.
We're Jewish, but we probably are a little different from many Jewish people here. And I think because I have a very foreign accent, even my children, think of me a bit as a foreigner.
When putting together this project, we were acutely aware that there is an Ashkenazi dominance in UK Jewish culture. When we think of Jewish food or music or even famous Jewish people, it's most likely we think of Ashkenazim.
Our friends who were Ashkenaz didn't understand our customs. You eat rice at Pesach, is that terrible? Yeah. My first husband was Ashkenaz. It was like marrying a non-Jew to me. Sorry.
Tash and I are both Ashkenazi. Both of our families originate in Eastern Europe.
This is probably the most common story in the UK, but it's not the whole story.
I've always said being Jewish is like having brown eyes. It is who I am. And being a Sephardic Jew, a Ladino Jew, explains my history. Otherwise, it's very difficult to identify that my parents were born in Turkey, I was born in Egypt, we had British...
And it just so happens, by chance, that they are all originally from Egypt.
My mother's best friends were Italian, Greek, Muslim, and we all celebrated each other's religion.
If you're short of a word, it might be actually better to find a word in Arabic or in Italian or in Greek or in whatever it is to actually say exactly what you meant.
The Jewish community lived in Egypt for 3,000 years, And in the 1940s, there were around 80,000 Jewish people recorded living in Egypt.
It is a question of identity more than a question of religious observance. As soon as I hear anywhere somebody speaking Arabic, I prick up my ears. And I say to myself, I wonder, because one of the things is, I feel I have more in common with an Egyptian when I go back to Alexandria or Cairo than with a Hasidic Jew from Stanmore.
Definitely.
Much too, and that shocks a lot on my Jewish friends here.
We sit in a cosy room at the top of an arts centre in North London. The lights are dim and the carpet and the walls are a warm orange colour.
My biggest memory is having a friend. We did everything. She came when it was Pesach, I knew when it was Ramadan. We spoke Arabic, we spoke French, we went to the little lycée together. I didn't consciously think, oh, she's Muslim, I'm Jewish. So the whole question of Jewishness really came up at the time of the expulsion.
After the Arab-Israeli War, anti-Semitism increased in Egypt, and in the 50s they were expelled.
As of December 2022, there are 3 Jewish people recorded living in Egypt.
I remember one particular Jewish festival, Shem El Nissim, where you walk down in the street.
Festival.
No, Egyptian festival. Oh, did I say Jewish? Sorry. No, I meant Egyptian festival. Shem El Nissim is a very Egyptian festival, but it was a lovely festival because they walked around carrying sugar dolls in the streets, and we thought it was absolutely wonderful. So we were walking around with them, carrying our sugar dolls. It was a lovely life.
It is estimated that about 850,000 Jews left the Middle East and North Africa post-1948, many of them settling in Israel, the USA and France. A small number of these came to the UK.
I came as a 9.5-year-old. I couldn't speak a word of English. We were in a refugee camp near Birmingham, and I was sent to a school in Birmingham. Suddenly it was like, you only mix with Jewish kids, or you go to this, this was all new to me. I spoke French, but I wasn't French. They asked, you're Egyptian, so go home. Yes, what was it? Go home, dirty walk. I didn't know what these words meant, and then I said, no, I'm Jewish. Oh, you killed Jesus. Now, I'd never heard that till I came to England. True. And I went home, and I remember my mother and my father, before we left Egypt, saying to me, when we go to England, it's so tolerant, you can wear your Magen David. And I thought, this is nice. I'm not going to have to feel nervous. And I ran home. I said, what is this? We killed Jesus. I lived in a tent. So I experienced anti-Semitism as a 9.5-year-old in a school in England, never in Egypt.
Today, about 15,000 Sephardi Mizrahi Jews live in the UK, which means they constitute around 6% of British Jewry.
I was never English, and there was always this feeling that I was foreign. And in fact, that feeling's only gone since we bought a home in Israel. And when I'm there and I hear Arabic, and I go to the market, and I go to the sea, and I see the same sunset as Egypt, I think, this is my makes me emotional, but it's true. But that's very recent, and I'm 75, so all this time I never felt I belonged, ever.
We probably work very hard, like all refugees do. And I think probably I've worked all my life to gain the security we had last.
Yes.
When I think back, it's because I wanted to be sure because we'd lost it all.
What we all had when we got here was it was drummed to us before Tony Blair, education. What we were told, if a Hitler or a Nasser can take the shirt off your back, if he doesn't put a bullet through your head, you will always have your...
Yes, my father said everything else comes and goes, but what's inside you, no one can take.
I don't know what is going to happen after our generation dies, because we're the last generation to have known life in Egypt. And that is very sad.
I find it very difficult to remember, actually. And I often wonder why.
Trauma.
Do you always?
I know exactly why.
I remember little things, that I used to stay on my balcony an awful lot, which obviously I don't do because you saw the life go by while you stood on the balcony. And I remember also that, the way they used to iron the
Makwaki.
They used to
spit
get
on they used to have these cast iron irons, which they would warm up on the prelude.
They did it as a spray.
Yeah.
So my friends would
mine
say
stuck on it.
spitting.
Yeah.
They have the water in their mouth and do.
Yeah, exactly.
And not only that, from the balcony, you could call the Makwaki and say, "Can you bring? Have you got the shirts ready?" And they would say, "Right, I'll bring them soon." And that sort of thing I remember.
Here's our producer Becky reflecting on the conversation she's just listened to.
I'm so shocked at how emotional and moved I was to hear people's stories from their childhood, and also just to hear about Sephardi Jews' stories from their childhood, which is stories I'm not so familiar with, and it was really moving. And even though those stories were not, there were elements that were very different to my own, I also really felt like a connection and a relation to them. It was quite eye-opening.
Egyptian culture is so clearly a huge facet of their identity, and it's tied up with their Jewishness. It's Egyptian Jewishness. It's almost impossible to see where one begins and the other ends, as we hear when one person gets confused and can't remember if it's a Jewish festival or an Egyptian festival.
It is so important that we hear these perspectives on Jewish people feeling closer to other Arabic-speaking cultures than to Ashkenazi Jewish cultures, because the narrative we often hear is of Jew versus Arab, and these people's experiences challenge that narrative.
And when we listen to these stories for the first time, there's something so singular about this story of Egyptian expulsion. And I also couldn't help but be reminded of the kinds of conversations I might have had with some of my relatives.
The experience of being a refugee in this country runs deep, transcends ethnicities and generations, and is a collective experience for Jewish people.
In all three stories, we see how as Jewish people in the UK, we are navigating our past, our trauma, and our inherited trauma, working out what to bring into our future, and how we are holding ourselves in the present.
In this final story, we ended up with the reliving of the everyday in Egypt, sitting on the balcony, watching life below, spitting on the iron.
Yes, there are gaps in the memories, as they say, because of the trauma.
But it's also choosing to remember, to relive and to celebrate.
Because being Jewish is as much in these small moments as it is in the larger narratives.
You've been listening to the Machloket podcast, a disagreement for a greater good, where we aim to explore, share and celebrate what life is like for all kinds of Jewish people in the UK. Over the next few months, we'll be releasing podcasts where we share different voices from around the country, who share different perspectives on what it means to be Jewish today. Find more information about the project in our show notes, including a link to transcripts, and don't forget to subscribe and rate us wherever you listen to your podcasts, and please recommend to a friend. Follow us on socials at Machloket Project.
We want to thank everyone we've met, everyone that's taken the time to speak to us, who's made us a cup of tea, logged onto Zoom, or invited us into their space. It's been a privilege and a pleasure to meet you all.
This podcast was presented and written by Nick Cassenbaum and Tash Hyman in collaboration with Take Stock Exchange. Produced by Anna Smith and Becky Plotnick. Composition and sound designed by Anna Clarke. With dramaturgy from Olly Hawes, consultancy from Aaron Keller, and funding from Arts Council England and the Royal Court Theatre. With big thanks to JW3, the Royal Court, Joss MacDonald, Isabel Coutinho, Ira Coutinho Cassenbaum, Morwenna Johnson, Sonny and Joss Johnson, Jessie Wild, M. Hilton, Tommy Ross Williams, and all the communities we've worked with and those who've helped us organise workshops. In this case, Sarah Levan and Daisy Aboudi, and all the communities we haven't yet managed to meet. We can't wait to meet you. Thanks for listening.